Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Welcome to France 24. We're live from Paris. I'm Sharon Gaffney, and these are the top stories this hour. European leaders pledge to remain united in their efforts to avert war on the continent, as the French president says there's a path forward on easing tensions with Russia over Ukraine. All eyes turn again to Berlin on Thursday for separate talks involving high-ranking officials. We'll have the very latest with our correspondent, Nick Spicer. A warning from authorities in Canada as nearly 2 weeks of trucker-led anti-vaccine protests threaten to disrupt food supply chains and the wider economy. This after the busiest border crossing into the US was partially blocked by the so-called Freedom Convoy. And Hong Kong introduces fresh restrictions as COVID cases surge. The measures include unprecedented limits on private gatherings, the closure of hair salons and places of worship. It comes after more than 1,100 new cases were detected on Wednesday. Also coming up this hour, proving that the cryptocurrency is not a safe haven for criminal gangs, billions of dollars worth of stolen Bitcoin have been recovered by authorities in the US. We'll bring you the details and the market reaction in our business update. And we'll be bringing you more on the TikTok sensation who spawned mashups and remixes on dance floors from South Africa to the Philippines, all at the tender age of 92. Firm dialogue with Moscow is the only way to diffuse fears that Russia could invade Ukraine. That's according to the French president, following his urgent round of shuttle diplomacy this week. Following meetings in Moscow, Kiev and Berlin, Emmanuel Macron said he'd secured assurances from his Russian counterpart that there'd be no deterioration or escalation in tensions. European leaders are pledging to remain united in their stated goal of averting war on the continent. Joseph Keane has the latest.
Showing a united front, Germany, France and Poland expressed their support for Ukraine's sovereignty. The country's leaders met in Berlin. At the heart of the discussions, tensions with Russia, which is said to have massed over 100,000 troops near its border with Ukraine.
Il y a un travail qui est mené par l'OTAN, par les États-Unis d'Amérique, par nous aussi en tant qu'alliés et en tant qu'Européens, pour bâtir les éléments de garantie de sécurité. Les derniers jours ont permis de faire émerger des pistes nouvelles. Nous allons ensemble y travailler.
De-escalation is something that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is also hoping for.
Unser gemeinsames Ziel ist es, einen Krieg in Europa zu verhindern. Eine weitere Verletzung der territorialen Integrität und Souveränität der Ukraine ist inakzeptabel und würde weitreichende Konsequenzen für Russland nach sich ziehen. Politisch, wirtschaftlich.
Earlier on Tuesday, President Volodymyr Zelensky hosted the French president in Kiev. The day before, President Macron held hours of talks with Vladimir Putin and claimed the Russian president promised the country would not escalate tensions. However, the Ukrainian leader remained unconvinced.
В принципі, слова, я не дуже словам довіряю, тому я вважаю, що у кожного політика відкритість в конкретних кроках. В нашому випадку це кроки щодо деескалації.
Envoys from France, Germany, Ukraine and Russia are set to meet in Berlin on Thursday as part of the Normandy format. These are peace talks aimed at ending almost 8 years of fighting in eastern Ukraine.
Following Emmanuel Macron's diplomatic tour of national capitals, the focus shifts back to Berlin on Thursday, where high-ranking officials are set to meet for separate talks. The Ukrainian president says those meetings could eventually pave the way for a summit involving himself and the leaders of Russia, France and Germany. Such a gathering would be aimed at reviving the stalled Minsk Agreement peace deal, Well, for more on what to expect, let's cross now to Berlin, where our correspondent Nick Spicer is standing by. Nick, the Minsk Accord, it's proven to be a real sticking point between Moscow and Kiev for most of the past decade, or since it was introduced back in 2015. What are the chances that it could be revived?
Well, at present, it seems pretty slim. It depends on the goodwill that both sides are willing to put in and what kind of diplomatic efforts the sort of shepherds, France and Germany, are able to undertake. There were two Minsk Accords. The second was really agreed under duress when Ukraine only had about 5,000 active soldiers at the time, were surrounded. So the perception in Ukraine is that the accords are not something that the president should really abide by. So he has that domestic political problem. And if you read them, they're only 4 pages long. It's pretty hard to understand the sequencing of events. It calls for demilitarizing the areas where there's been conflict, mercenaries to leave and so on. It also calls for elections. It calls for negotiations with the leaders of the two sort of breakaway republics and some kind of autonomy. Now, the Russians think that the Ukrainian government should talk with the self-designated leaders in those areas who are pro-Kremlin leaders before there are elections. The Ukrainian thinks there should be elections so that the voice of the people can be heard. So there's all kinds of disagreement about the sequencing of things, and for any kind of negotiations to really come to some kind of conclusion, I think there needs to be clarity on how all of this works. When you read them, you just keep checking off the things that they promised to do that have not been done. So there's a lot of work for the two parties to undertake. A lot of goodwill will be needed, but I think the takeaway is perhaps you will have Ukrainians and Russians at the table. Once again, they tried to talk about this in Paris in the past 3 weeks, not very successfully, but at least there seems to be some kind of attempt at forward movement.
And Nick, meanwhile, the German Chancellor is engaging in what you might call verbal gymnastics over the controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
It's really the source of humor here in Germany. And, you know, if you're a fan of the Harry Potter series, it's almost a pipeline that cannot be named, like Lord Voldemort. Nord Stream 2, those are words that have not emerged from the mouth of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, despite the attempts of all kinds of journalists to ask him, is that 1,200-kilometer pipeline on the table as leverage against Russia? And he'll typically respond by saying all kinds of options are on the table. Russia will feel all kinds of economic pain if it decides to invade Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is that Germany is sort of tied in knots around this 1,200-kilometer pipeline because it relies on Russia for lots of its gas exports. Olaf Scholz, in his defense, is saying that he wants to maintain strategic ambiguity by not saying what's on the table. But the American President Joe Biden stepped in for him and said that the Nord Stream pipeline, which is not yet pumping gas, would not pump gas if Russia were to invade Ukraine, and this through the American ability to impose sanctions on all kinds of companies that would be involved in using it. So Olaf Scholz not willing to pronounce the word Nord Stream 2, but the American president certainly is, and certainly seems to be willing to be using it as a weapon, as leverage against the Kremlin.
Nick Spicer reporting there from Berlin. Well, the Canadian government is warning that food supply chains may be disrupted by blockades caused by trucker-led protests in the capital, Ottawa. The city remains under a state of emergency with nearly 80 criminal investigations underway into the so-called Freedom Convoy rallies. The country's transport minister says the protests will have serious implications for the economy. It comes after a border crossing between Canada and the US, described as one of the most important in the world, was partially blocked by demonstrators. Solange Mougin has the latest.
A blockade where it hurts. This is Ambassador Bridge, the busiest land crossing between the US and Canada. Normally some 8,000 trucks cross here daily, carrying 25% of trade. But traffic has been blocked off or slowed to a crawl's pace by protesting truckers, threatening already stretched supply chains on both sides of the border. Nearing the 2-week mark of their protests in Ottawa, truckers also continue to disrupt daily life in the capital. They're demanding Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resign because of Canada's border vaccine requirements and other COVID restrictions.
The masks don't make sense. None of the laws that they've come up with, their little rules and mandates make sense. Their mandates have been way out of control.
Hunkering down even if Canada's truck unions and the majority of drivers are against the blockades. The protesters of the so-called Freedom Convoy say they're in for the long haul.
Well, if you take a shot of my truck, you'll see my tires are off. So what does that tell you?
Ottawa's tow truck companies have refused to move the parked vehicles out of fear of backlash. Since Sunday, police have been slowly taking back some control, seizing thousands of litres of fuel. But a quarter of the over 400 trucks have children living in them, with their parent drivers, making breakup efforts more complicated. In an emergency debate, Justin Trudeau pushed back against Conservatives, calling for him to do more.
Unfortunately, we see Conservatives continuing to both call an end to the protests from in here and support them out there. They need to be more responsible leaders to get through this and to play less politics.
Meanwhile, with COVID case numbers going down, multiple provinces have already announced plans to lift some COVID restrictions.
As COVID cases surge, Hong Kong is set for its toughest social distancing restrictions yet. Authorities in the city are introducing unprecedented limits on private gatherings after almost 1,200 new infections were recorded on Wednesday. It's a record high for the global financial hub that's been struggling to contain an outbreak of the Omicron variant. For more on what exactly has been announced, we've been speaking with our correspondent in Hong Kong, Oliver Farry.
The Hong Kong government has said that no more than one household may visit another at any time. That is a lot more generous than has been the case in many Western countries. But it also has to be said that in Hong Kong, house visits are not really as big a thing as they would be in many other countries. Places of worship have also been forced to close down from tomorrow. And hairdressers, that is the first time it has happened since the start of the pandemic 2 years ago. Hong Kongers were among the first in the world to take COVID very seriously when it first arrived in the city in January. That's mainly because of their previous experience with SARS in 2004. However, or 2003 rather. However, this time, ever since the first Omicron outbreak at Christmas, they have been noticeably very sluggish with regard to social distancing measures. People haven't really been that worried about it, probably because they've seen that Omicron abroad has not been particularly deadly compared to previous strains, and they have decided that just to go along with things, and the government has also been a little bit slack in responding. It was due to bring in a vaccine pass, but it put it back until the 24th of February, so to give restaurants more time to organise for it. Restaurants are still open. They can't serve beyond 6 p.m, but they can still open for a maximum of 2 or 4 people, depending on their status during the day. However, there is a problem in Hong Kong with regard to Delta. Delta has only a small number of the cases in Hong Kong, but however, it does account for 75% of the handful of critical or serious cases in hospital. And Hong Kong also had its 215th death from COVID last night. That was the first death since last September. There's also a worry that only 50% of over 70s in Hong Kong are vaccinated against the virus.
Police say it proves that Bitcoin isn't a safe haven for criminal gangs. Billions of dollars worth of the stolen cryptocurrency have been recovered by authorities in the US. 2 people, a couple from New York, are facing up to 2 decades in prison after being charged in connection with the seizure. Here's Peter O'Brien with the details.
She's not who you might expect to be the target of a federal asset seizure worth billions of US dollars.
Get icy like froyo, all gotta stay vocal. Bitcoin, Ethereum, hodl.
New Yorker Heather Morgan, aka Razzle Khan, raps and gives business advice on TikTok, calling herself a badass money maker. She and her husband Ilya Lichtenstein were arrested on Tuesday, charged with conspiring to launder almost 120,000 Bitcoin and defrauding the United States. The crypto money was stolen in 2016. At the time, it was worth around $70 million. Now it's worth $4.5 billion. The US Justice Department was able to recover more than 3/4 of this, the largest single financial seizure in its history.
The message to criminals is clear. Cryptocurrency is not a safe haven. We can and we will follow the money no matter what form it takes.
The Bitcoin was stolen in a hack of the digital currency exchange Bitfinex. US officials haven't said who was behind the attack in 2016, but they've said Liechtenstein and Morgan laundered about 25,000 Bitcoin through various crypto transactions and accounts, through purchases of gold and NFTs, and through Morgan's startup. The couple are appearing in federal court, where they could be sentenced to up to 2 decades in prison.
It spawned mashups and remixes on dance floors from South Africa to the Philippines and an unlikely dinner date with a president. A 92-year-old Malawian music legend has become a social media sensation after his reggae hit garnered over 80 million views on the video sharing platform TikTok.
Gires Chalamanda is not on social media and doesn't even own a smartphone. But that didn't stop the Malawian musician from becoming a TikTok sensation. At 92 years old, Chalamanda says he's enjoying every bit of his newfound celebrity.
Ndiponso ndikamayimba anthu amasangalala nazo ndipo amavina kwambiri ndipo kundifupanso makobiri kokoni kuposa salary.
In the fall of 2020, Chalamanda recorded a reggae version of his song Linihu, which he'd written 20 years prior as an homage to his daughter. The song was an immediate hit on YouTube and even more so on TikTok, where it quickly became viral and has been viewed over 80 million times. Now Chalamanda can't go outside without being recognized, and his young fans often feel inspired by the 92-year-old's energy and wisdom.
I like Chalamanda's music because he's an old guy, and obviously he knows a lot more to life. So, he shares his life experiences and a lot of sensible things in his songs.
Over the past few months, Chalamanda has received dozens of offers for concerts and was even invited to dinner by Malawi's president. But the musician has yet to receive any royalties or compensation for his viral social media videos.
Time now for a look at some of the top stories this hour. European leaders pledged to remain united in their efforts to avert war on the continent, as the French president says there's a path forward on easing tensions with Russia over Ukraine. All eyes turn again to Berlin on Thursday for separate talks involving high-ranking officials. A warning from authorities in Canada as nearly 2 weeks of trucker-led anti-vaccine protests threaten to disrupt food supply chains and the wider economy. This after the busiest border crossing into the US was partially blocked by the so-called Freedom Convoy. And Hong Kong introduces fresh restrictions as COVID cases surge. The measures include unprecedented limits on private gatherings and the closure of hair salons and places of worship. It comes after more than 1,100 new cases were detected on Wednesday. It's time now for a look at some of the day's top business stories and how the price of Bitcoin has been reacting to that cryptocurrency theft case in the US. Our business editor, Stephen Carroll, is here with more.
Sharon, the cryptocurrency at the centre of that case, according to court documents, was taken from the Hong Kong